My lights went dark on a Tuesday night. The HOA president smiled the whole time. She said it was just a scheduling mix-up. 1 month became 2, then 5. My daughter's nebulizer ran on borrowed car batteries. Then I found her brother-in-law's name on our invoices. 5 months of silence. She thought I'd break first. I didn't break. Cost her $70,000. My name is Sarah Coleman, and before any of this, my life was ordinary in the best way. I worked as a freelance bookkeeper from our home office in Willow Creek Estates. My husband Tom taught middle school science. And our daughter Lily, 8 years old, loved chalk drawings and had asthma we'd learned to manage. We were happy. We paid our HOA dues on time. Willow Creek was the kind of neighborhood with matching mailboxes and a strict architectural committee, run by a board that took itself very seriously. At the center of it sat Deborah Krantz, HOA president for 6 years running, a woman with a clipboard permanently under one arm and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Everyone respected her. Almost everyone feared her more. Deborah had built her reign on small rules enforced with enormous force. A trash can left out an hour too long meant a violation letter. A wind chime too loud meant a warning. People joked about her behind closed doors, but never to her face. Because Deborah remembered everything, and grudges in Willow Creek had long, patient lifespans. Our neighborhood ran on a shared private power grid. An old arrangement from when the development was built. One transformer station fed the whole block. Maintained under an HOA services contract instead of the city utility. Most residents never thought twice about it. I didn't either. Not yet. It was just a line item on our dues statement. Tom used to say Deborah collected power the way other people collected coins. Quietly, compulsively, never quite satisfied. She'd absorbed the treasurer's duties 2 years back after restructuring the board, which really just meant fewer people had eyes on the books anymore. Nobody questioned it. Lily's asthma had gotten worse that spring. Her pediatrician recommended a home nebulizer routine. Twice daily, sometimes more during flare-ups. It became part of our rhythm, the little machine humming on the kitchen counter every morning while she ate her cereal. It was medical equipment. It ran on electricity. That fact would matter more than I ever imagined. My first real interaction with Deborah came at a spring block party. Pleasant enough on the surface. She complimented my flower beds, then mentioned, almost as an aside, that our shed's paint color was borderline non-compliant with community guidelines. I laughed it off. A week later, an official notice arrived. Not about the shed, about our porch light fixture, apparently installed without prior design approval 3 years earlier by the previous owner. 90-day compliance window, it said, or a $50 monthly fine would begin accruing. I called the number listed. Deborah answered personally. Rules are rules. Sarah, she told me, warm as syrup, cold underneath. I don't make exceptions. Exceptions are how neighborhoods fall apart. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say about a porch light. I didn't yet understand that with Deborah. Nothing was ever really about the porch light. Renee, our neighbor across the street, warned me over the fence one evening while watering her tomatoes. She picked someone new every year, Renee said quietly. Last year it was the Ortegas. Year before, the Whitmores moved out rather than keep fighting her. I asked why nobody reported her to the actual board. Renee just laughed, tired and short. She is the board, Renee said. Marla just nods along, and everyone else resigned or got voted off. I filed that away, uneasy, but not yet alarmed. We fixed the porch light. We paid the small fine rather than fight it. Seemed easier. It was neither. What I didn't know then was that Deborah's late husband had left behind a construction and electrical business, quietly absorbed after his death by her sister's husband, Gary Fenn. Fenn Power Solutions held the maintenance contract for our shared grid, renewed year after year without competing bids, buried deep in HOA meeting minutes nobody read. I only learned Gary's name because Tom mentioned seeing his truck parked outside the transformer station one Saturday. Engine running, nobody working. Weird crew, Tom said, shrugging it off. I shrugged too. Fertilizer schedule and a mortgage and 100 more urgent things to think about than a stranger's idling truck. That June, the HOA sent a newsletter announcing planned infrastructure upgrades to the community power system, staggered over several weekends, each street losing power for a few hours at a time for necessary maintenance. Nothing alarming. Every neighborhood did this eventually. I circled our street scheduled date on the calendar and thought nothing more of it. Lily's asthma flared badly that same week. An ordinary summer trigger, pollen, heat, a cold she couldn't shake. Her doctor added a second daily nebulizer session and mentioned, almost casually, that if it worsened we might need a home oxygen concentrator down the line. I nodded, filed it under future problems, and drove home. None of us knew yet that a single line in an obscure HOA bylaw, one giving the board discretion over restoration timelines during infrastructure work, would soon become the most dangerous 4 words in our entire lives. Deborah knew it, though. Deborah had read every word of that bylaw a long time ago. The small conflict that started everything began, absurdly, with a portable generator. After 2 brief outages during the planned maintenance, I bought a small backup unit online, mostly for Lily's nebulizer, and set it in our garage, and used unless needed. I didn't think it required approval. Generators weren't mentioned anywhere in our welcome packet. Deborah apparently disagreed. Within a week, a violation notice appeared on our door, unauthorized exterior equipment, referencing the generator visible through our open garage door one afternoon. I called, explained it was for my daughter's medical device, offered to keep the door closed. Deborah's tone shifted, sharper now. Medical or not, it needs board approval, she said. I submitted the approval request that same night, attaching Lily's doctor's note about her nebulizer dependency. 2 weeks passed with no response. I followed up. It was under review by the architectural committee, though Renee later told me that committee hadn't formally met in over a year. At the next open HOA meeting, I raised my hand and asked, politely, why a medical accommodation request was taking longer than a paint color dispute. A few neighbors nodded along quietly. Deborah's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. We treat every request equally, Sarah, she said. No special treatment. I said I wasn't asking for special treatment, just a timely answer for a documented medical need. Came out steadier than I felt. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Deborah adjourned the meeting 11 minutes early that night. The first time anyone could remember that happening. Walking to my car afterward, Renee caught my arm. "You embarrassed her in front of people," she whispered. "In public." I told her I'd only asked a fair question. Renee's face said she believed me, and also that fairness had never once mattered to Deborah Krantz. The generator approval arrived 4 days later, denied, citing aesthetic incompatibility with neighborhood standards, with a note that any future placement, even hidden inside our closed garage, would incur a $200 monthly fine. I read it twice, certain I'd misunderstood. I hadn't. Time and simply said, "This isn't about the generator anymore." I appealed the denial in writing, citing federal fair housing guidance on reasonable accommodations for medical equipment. Deborah's written response was 2 sentences long. "The board has reviewed your appeal. The original decision stands. No explanation. No further discussion offered." It felt less like a ruling and more like a door slamming shut on purpose. That same week, our recycling bin was cited for being visible from the street 2 hours past pickup, something half the block was routinely guilty of without consequence. Coincidence? Maybe. I chose to believe it was coincidence, because the alternative felt paranoid, felt exhausting, felt like something I didn't have room for. Tom wanted to fight harder, hire someone, escalate immediately. I wanted to keep the peace, worried about our home's resale value, worried about becoming that difficult family on the street. We argued about it quietly in the kitchen, while Lily's nebulizer hissed softly in the background. Oblivious to any of it, I started keeping a folder. Every letter, every email, every date and time, printed and dated in a growing manila envelope in my desk drawer. Felt silly at first, almost paranoid. Looking back, it was the single smartest thing I did in those early weeks, and I didn't even know why yet. Renee mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd once seen Deborah's name listed as an emergency contact on a Fen Power Solutions work order left on a neighbor's porch. I asked who Fen Power Solutions was. Renee shrugged, the company that handled our grid maintenance. She thought. I wrote the name down anyway. Small fines kept arriving through July, mailbox flag angle, a garden hose left coiled improperly, a bird bath deemed non-conforming. Each one absurd alone, together forming a pattern I couldn't yet name but could clearly feel, like pressure building steadily behind a closed door somewhere in the house. At a neighborhood cookout, another resident, an older man named Frank, quietly told me he'd fought Deborah over a fence height dispute 2 years earlier. He'd won, technically, after months of appeals. But she found other ways, he said. Voice low. Always does. You just survive her. I asked Frank what he meant by other ways. He glanced toward Deborah's house across the cul-de-sac before answering. Things break around here, near people she doesn't like. Sprinkler timers. Once, a whole line of shrubs died overnight. He didn't accuse her directly. He didn't have to. I told myself Frank was exaggerating, the way small communities sometimes turn one difficult person into local legend. I wanted to believe that. Believing anything else meant admitting my family had quietly become a target. And I wasn't ready to carry that weight yet. Not with everything else already on my plate. By early August, the fines had reached almost $600. Unpaid on principal, sitting in my folder alongside every appeal I'd filed. Then the newsletter came again. Our street's final infrastructure maintenance window was scheduled for the following Tuesday. 4 hours of planned downtime. Routine. Ordinary. Nothing to worry about. I circled the date anyway. Tuesday's outage started on schedule at 9 in the morning. Same as the newsletter promised. I unplugged Lily's nebulizer, pulled out the battery pack we kept for exactly this reason, and settled in to wait it out, the way we had for every prior maintenance window that summer. For hours passed. By early evening, every other house on our cul-de-sac had power humming again, porch lights on, air conditioners cycling except ours. I called the emergency line listed in the newsletter. A recording said crews were addressing an isolated equipment issue and would restore service shortly. Shortly became midnight. I called again. Someone at Fen Power Solutions apologized vaguely and said our line required additional parts not immediately available. I asked how long. I asked to speak with a supervisor. He said the supervisor wasn't available until morning. We ran the small generator that night for Lily's nebulizer and the refrigerator, rationing its narrow fuel tank, checking the weather app every hour praying for cooler air. Tom sat up with me at the kitchen table, both of us staring at our phones, waiting for an update that never came. By Wednesday afternoon, still no power. I drove to Deborah's house myself, folder in hand, calm on the outside, unraveling underneath. She answered the door in gardening gloves, unsurprised to see me. I heard about your outage, she said, before I'd said a single word. Such bad luck. Isolated to your address. I asked her directly whether this was connected to our earlier disputes. She looked genuinely wounded by the question, hand pressed to her chest. Sarah, I would never, she said, voice trembling with practiced offense. I'm the president. Contractor's repair schedule. That's simply how infrastructure works sometimes. I wanted to believe her. Exhausted part of me needed to believe her, because the alternative meant someone had deliberately decided my daughter's medical equipment didn't matter to them. I drove home with nothing resolved. Generator fuel running low. Sunset coming. Another dark night ahead of us. Day 3. I called the County Utility Commission, hoping for outside help, only to learn our neighborhood's private grid arrangement placed us outside their direct jurisdiction, a quirk of the original 1990s development contract that Deborah, I would later learn, understood far better than any regulator did. Day 5. Fen Power Solutions finally sent a technician, a tired young man named Marcus who spent 40 minutes at our breaker box before shaking his head. Nothing wrong here that I can see, he said, confused. Whatever's holding this up, it isn't a parts issue. I don't understand why they told you that. Marcus left without restoring anything, saying only that his supervisor, Gary Fenn, had specifically flagged our address as under review. Do not proceed without authorization. I asked authorization from whom? Marcus shrugged, uncomfortable, already backing toward his truck. Above my pay grade, ma'am. I just follow the work order. That night, I finally said the word out loud to Tom that I'd been avoiding for a week. Retaliation. He didn't argue with me anymore. He just nodded slowly, jaw tight, and went to check the generator fuel level for the 4th time that evening. because that was the only thing either of us could actually control. We started rationing everything. The refrigerator opened only twice a day. Phone chargers shared between shifts. Lily's nebulizer treatments carefully spaced to preserve the generator's limited battery reserve overnight. She asked, more than once, why our house was the only dark one on the street. I never had a good answer. 2 weeks in, our generator's small engine finally gave out under the strain, overworked far beyond its intended use. We spent nights at a budget motel 20 minutes away when we could afford it, and sweltering nights at home when we couldn't. Lily's inhaler working overtime in the thick summer heat. I filed a formal written complaint with the HOA board, citing the outage's disproportionate length and its impact on a documented medical accommodation. Deborah's reply arrived 9 days later. The board sympathizes with your situation but has no authority over third-party contractor timelines. We recommend patience while repairs proceed. Patience. So many times it stopped meaning anything at all. Just shapes on a page. Meanwhile, I noticed something odd scrolling through the neighborhood's private social media group. Several other residents mentioning their power had been restored within the promised 4-hour window. No delays. No missing parts. I began quietly messaging neighbors directly, asking whether their outages had run long too. Most said no. Restored on time exactly as scheduled. One woman, hesitant, admitted hers took an extra day, right after she'd publicly disagreed with Deborah about a landscaping vote 2 months earlier. Pattern. Forming in daylight now. Frank, the man from the cookout, reached out unprompted after hearing about our outage through the neighborhood grapevine. Told you, he said quietly over the phone. It's never the actual rule. It's whoever she's decided doesn't respect her authority enough. You asked one question too many at that meeting. Sarah. Month 1 of no power ended with Lily developing a persistent cough that worsened overnight. The heat and disrupted treatment schedule clearly taking a toll. Her pediatrician, alarmed at our follow-up visit, recommended we consider a portable oxygen concentrator if her condition didn't stabilize soon. Another electric device. Another thing we couldn't reliably run. I called the HOA emergency line again, this time explaining Lily's worsening symptoms in detail, practically pleading. The woman on the phone, not Deborah this time, sounded genuinely sympathetic and promised to flag it as urgent. Nothing changed. I would later learn that urgent flags meant nothing without Deborah's personal sign-off. Tom, normally patient to a fault, drove to the HOA office himself and demanded answers face-to-face. He came home an hour later, quieter than I'd ever seen him, and told me Deborah had informed him, almost gently, that our outstanding unpaid fines complicated the contractor's prioritization process. Nothing about medical urgency. Only money. That was the first time I understood the shape of what was happening. This wasn't random bureaucratic slowness. This was a woman with just enough control over an obscure private utility contract, using it as leverage against a family who had dared to question her authority once. In public, at a meeting 11 weeks earlier, I started documenting everything with new urgency, recording phone calls where legally permitted, saving every email with timestamps, photographing our dark house against the glowing windows of every neighbor around us. My folder grew thick. I bought a second one. Exhaustion. Something colder and more determined was taking root. Month 2 arrived with no resolution. We'd spent nearly $4,000 on motels, restaurant meals we couldn't cook at home, and a replacement generator that also struggled under constant use. Our savings, modest but hard-earned, drained faster than either of us wanted to admit out loud to each other. I contacted a local news tip line on a whim one exhausted evening, describing our situation in a brief message, not really expecting a response. A junior reporter named Priya called back within 2 days, intrigued, though she warned me these HOA power imbalance stories rarely got traction without hard documentation. I told her I had plenty. Priya's interest gave me something I badly needed: motivation to organize my folder properly, chronologically, cross-referenced with the neighborhood social media posts showing other residents' quick restorations. I built a timeline on my kitchen table late at night after Lily fell asleep, cross-legged on the floor surrounded by printed pages. Deborah, apparently sensing the reporter's interest through the neighborhood grapevine, sent an unexpected email offering a goodwill gesture: a temporary loaner generator from the HOA's emergency supply, delivered by, unsurprisingly, a Fen Power Solutions truck. I accepted it, grateful despite my growing suspicion, needing relief more than principle in that exhausted moment. The loaner generator ran beautifully for exactly 6 days before mysteriously failing. A frayed internal wire that the delivery technician, again Marcus, seemed almost embarrassed to discover. "This shouldn't have happened," he muttered, more to himself than to me, checking the wire twice before writing his report. I asked Marcus directly whether Gary Fenn and Deborah Krantz were related. He hesitated a long moment, glancing toward his truck as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Family," he finally said, low and quick. "Brother-in-law. Knows not to ask questions about the Willow Creek accounts." Then he left, faster than usual. That single sentence changed everything. I drove to the county clerk's office that same afternoon and pulled public business registration records for Fen Power Solutions, my hands not quite steady on the counter. There it was, listed plainly: Gary Fenn, owner, married to Linda Fenn, Deborah Krantz's younger sister. A family business, quietly holding an uncompeted maintenance contract for years, apparently answering directly to Deborah's personal preferences rather than genuine repair priorities. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the paper, feeling something shift permanently inside my chest, fear curdling slowly into resolve. I called Priya back and told her what I'd found. She went quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "That's not just a bad neighbor story anymore, Sarah. That's potentially a conflict of interest story, maybe fraud, depending on how the contract was awarded." She asked if I'd be willing to file a formal public records request for HOA financials. I filed the request that week under our state's HOA disclosure statutes, requesting 3 years of vendor contracts, board meeting minutes, and payment records. Deborah's office initially claimed the request was overly broad and would take 90 days to process. I reminded them, in writing, that state law allowed 30. They stopped responding for 11 days. Month 3 began with Lily's asthma spiraling into her first ER visit. Oxygen levels dropping during a nighttime flare-up we couldn't manage without a working nebulizer at 3 in the morning. We sat in the emergency room until dawn, machines beeping steadily around us, my phone full of unanswered HOA emails glowing uselessly in my pocket. The attending doctor, hearing our situation, wrote a formal letter documenting Lily's condition and the medical necessity of consistent home power access, addressed directly to the HOA board with copies for our records. Felt, for the first time in months, like someone official had put real weight behind our side of things. I hand-delivered that letter to the HOA office myself, refusing to leave until someone signed for it. Marla, the treasurer, accepted it with visibly shaking hands, avoiding eye contact the entire time. She whispered, so quietly I almost missed it, "I'm sorry, Sarah. I really am. Anymore." Marla's comment stayed with me for days. It's not my decision anymore. Whose decision was it, then, if not the board's collectively? I began to suspect the board I'd been fighting for months existed mostly on paper, a rubber stamp surrounding one person who made every meaningful choice alone. Renee, watching all of this unfold from across the street, finally agreed to go on record with Priya, describing years of smaller retaliations she'd witnessed against other families, the Ortegas, the Whitmores, others who'd simply given up and moved rather than fight. A pattern stretching back years, not months. Priya's editor greenlit a real investigative piece, requesting more time to verify records before publication, cautious about libel exposure given Deborah's community standing. I understood the caution even as it frustrated me. Real stories, real consequences, needed real proof, not just anger, however justified that anger felt in the moment. I hired an attorney that week, Patricia Nguyen, a sharp, unhurried woman who specialized in HOA disputes and, more importantly, didn't flinch when I laid the whole folder out across her desk. She read for nearly an hour in silence before finally looking up. "This is more than a bad neighbor dispute," she said. "This looks like a pattern of retaliation tied to a self-dealing vendor contract," Patricia continued, tapping the Fen Power Solutions paperwork. "If the timeline holds up, and if those financial records show what I think they'll show, you're not just looking at restored power. You're looking at real damages." I finally let myself breathe. For 2 strange weeks in early autumn, everything went quiet. Our power, remarkably, flickered back on without warning or explanation on a Thursday afternoon. No call, no letter, just lights humming to life as if nothing had ever happened. I stood in my kitchen and cried, relief and suspicion tangled together. Deborah sent a brief, almost cheerful note the next day. "So glad the contractor finally resolved the parts issue. Let's put this behind us." No apology. No acknowledgement of 5 months. Just a tidy little bow tied over an open wound, as if closing the subject by decree alone. Tom wanted to believe it was truly over. Lily, oblivious to the politics, was simply thrilled to watch cartoons again on our old television. For a few days, our house felt almost normal, and I let myself imagine, briefly, walking away from all of it, letting the folder gather dust in a drawer somewhere. Patricia advised against that impulse immediately. "This is exactly when people quit," she warned me over the phone. "Right when the pressure eases. Don't stop now. Power ends the accountability. She'll do this again to someone else next year." Her words settled uncomfortably in my chest. I kept pursuing the public records request anyway, quietly, without fanfare. 2 more weeks passed before a thin envelope finally arrived from the HOA office. Heavily redacted meeting minutes, incomplete vendor invoices, gaps where whole months of financial detail simply didn't exist.
Patricia called it.
At the community's fall social, Deborah greeted me warmly in front of other neighbors, complimenting Lily's Halloween costume idea, acting as though the previous 5 months were a minor weather event rather than a deliberate campaign. I smiled back, matching her performance beat for beat, my folder waiting patiently at home. Renee pulled me aside during that same event, voice barely above a whisper. "She's already talking about a special assessment," Renee said. "Emergency Infrastructure Fund, she's calling it. Guess whose company gets that contract too?" I felt the brief calm of the past 2 weeks evaporate entirely, replaced by something sharper. Sure enough, within days, a newsletter announced an emergency vote on a $150 special assessment per household, framed as necessary grid modernization following the unfortunate recent equipment failures. Fen Power Solutions was named directly as the recommended contractor for the upgrade. No competing bids mentioned anywhere in the proposal. I raised the redacted records issue formally with Patricia, who filed a follow-up demand citing specific statutory violations in the disclosure response. The HOA's own attorney, CC'd for the first time, replied within 48 hours, noticeably faster than anything Deborah's office had managed in 5 full months. That attorney's quick response told me something important. Someone besides Deborah understood exactly how exposed these records might be if fully released. Legal counsel moved fast when liability loomed, and their sudden urgency felt like the first genuine crack in a wall that had seemed, until then, completely solid. Patricia and I met again, this time with a clearer strategy forming. She recommended we let the special assessment vote proceed publicly, giving us a documented, dated moment where Deborah's financial conflict of interest would be forced into the open, on record, in front of every homeowner in Willow Creek. "Sunlight is the best evidence," Patricia said, closing her laptop. "Let her propose the vote. Let her stand up and recommend her own brother-in-law's company again. Publicly, one more time. We'll be ready." Feeling for the first time in months like I was steering something instead of just surviving it. I spent the following 2 weeks quietly reaching out to other affected families, the Ortegas, now living 2 towns over, the Whitmores, still bitter about their own unresolved disputes. Several agreed, cautiously, to share their stories with Patricia, building a pattern far larger than my family's 5 dark months alone. By the time the emergency assessment vote was scheduled, I had 6 other households willing to speak up, a records request slowly forcing transparency, a journalist finishing her verification, and an attorney who believed, cautiously but firmly, that we finally had enough. The calm was ending. The vote meeting was scheduled for the community clubhouse on a Thursday evening. Attendance mandatory for the assessment to legally pass. I arrived early with Patricia, our folder organized into labeled sections, copies prepared for every board member and, quietly, for Priya, seated near the back with her notebook open. Deborah opened the meeting exactly as expected, warm and composed, walking through slides about aging infrastructure and necessary modernization, never once mentioning her family connection to the recommended contractor. Marla sat beside her, unusually pale, hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes fixed somewhere on the floor throughout the entire presentation. When Deborah opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand and asked, calmly, whether the board had solicited competing bids for the recommended contractor. She said no competing bids were necessary given Fen Power Solutions' established relationship and familiarity with our system. I asked her to describe that relationship for the room. They've serviced our grid for years, she said smoothly. I asked, still calm, whether she was aware the company's owner was her brother-in-law. The room went very still. Deborah's smile flickered, just barely, a hairline crack in porcelain. That's not relevant to the quality of their work, she said. Voice tightening slightly, I pulled the public business registration documents from my folder and read the names aloud. Plainly, without embellishment, Gary Fenn, owner, Linda Fenn, spouse, Linda Fenn, sister of Deborah Krantz. Murmurs rippled through the clubhouse. Someone near the front audibly gasped. Deborah's composure held, but only just, knuckles whitening around her clipboard. This is a personal attack, Deborah said, voice rising slightly, dressed up as due diligence. I've served this community faithfully for 6 years. I said I wasn't attacking her service record. I was asking why my family's power had stayed off for 5 months while every other household on our street was restored within hours. That question, finally spoken plainly in front of the entire room, landed differently than any private conversation ever had. Frank stood up from his seat, unprompted, and said loudly that he'd experienced similar delays 2 years earlier, right after disputing a fence violation with the board. The room's attention shifted entirely. One by one, hesitantly at first, other residents began speaking. The Whitmore's representative, connected by video call, described their forced move after months of unresolved disputes. A young couple near the back described sudden, unexplained fines after questioning a landscaping contract. The pattern Renee had warned me about months earlier stood fully exposed now. Deborah tried to regain control of the meeting, banging her gavel twice, insisting the discussion had strayed from the agenda item. Patricia stood calmly and reminded the room, and the recording secretary, that Robert's rules permitted relevant discussion tied directly to a proposed contractor recommendation currently on the floor for a vote. Marla, the treasurer, suddenly spoke for the first time all evening, voice shaking but audible. I have concerns about how these contracts have been awarded, she said quietly, refusing to look at Deborah beside her. I've raised them before. Privately. I was told it wasn't my place to question them. The room fell utterly silent. Deborah turned toward Marla with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Something colder and less composed than her usual practiced calm. Marla, this isn't the time, she said sharply. Marla, visibly trembling but resolute, replied that she believed, given everything being discussed, it was exactly the time. I asked the room directly whether anyone believed the assessment vote should proceed without first reviewing 3 years of unredacted financial records, given the concerns now openly on the table. A wave of hands rose across the clubhouse, far more than the simple majority needed to table the motion entirely. The vote to table passed overwhelmingly, 29-4, an outcome that would have been unthinkable at any prior meeting under Deborah's tightly controlled agenda. She stood at the podium for a long moment afterward, papers still in hand, looking, for the very first time since I'd known her, genuinely uncertain. As the meeting broke up, Priya approached Deborah directly for comment. Notebook open, recorder visible. Deborah declined to answer, walking briskly toward the exit. Gary Fenn's number already lighting up her phone screen as she went, visible to anyone standing close enough behind her. Which, deliberately, I was. Patricia caught up with me in the parking lot afterward, uncharacteristically animated. That was better than I even hoped for, she said. Public admission of the relationship. Treasurer breaking ranks on record. 7 households with documented complaints. We have more than enough now to file formally. Are you ready for that? I said yes without hesitating. 2 days later, Marla called me directly, her voice steadier than it had been at the meeting. She said she wanted to cooperate fully, that she'd kept her own private notes over the years documenting decisions she'd been pressured to approve without proper discussion. She agreed to meet with Patricia the following morning. Marla's notes, spanning nearly 3 years, detailed a consistent pattern. Contracts steered toward Fenn Power Solutions without competitive bidding. HOA reserve funds quietly, redirected to cover cost overruns on that same contract. And repeated instances of service delays, coinciding suspiciously with residents who had recently challenged Deborah publicly. Patricia cross-referenced Marla's notes against the partial records we'd already obtained, and against Renee's and Frank's first-hand accounts, building a timeline that stretched back far longer than I'd realized. My 5 dark months, turned out, weren't an isolated act of spite. They were simply the most recent chapter in a much longer story. The redacted financial gaps I'd noticed earlier suddenly made painful sense. Nearly $40,000 in HOA reserve funds, meant for genuine infrastructure needs, had been funneled toward Fenn Power Solutions over 3 years at rates well above competitive market pricing. According to an independent electrician Patricia consulted for comparison figures. Priya's story, now fully verified with documented sources, records, and multiple on-record interviews, was scheduled for publication the following week in the regional paper, timed carefully alongside Patricia's formal legal filing against the HOA board and Fenn Power Solutions jointly, alleging breach of fiduciary duty and retaliatory conduct. I drafted a written statement with Patricia's guidance, calm and factual, focused less on my own anger and more on Lily's medical records, the emergency room visit, the documented timeline proving other households' quick restorations against our own prolonged outage. Facts, Patricia reminded me, carried more weight in court than fury ever would. Deborah, apparently sensing the walls closing in, sent an unexpected personal email to me directly, tone entirely different from before, conciliatory, almost pleading, offering to waive all outstanding fines and personally cover our medical expenses if we agreed to resolve this privately before any formal filing occurred. I forwarded it straight to Patricia. Patricia called it, plainly, an attempted settlement to avoid discovery. Exactly the kind of desperate move that confirmed we were closer to real accountability than Deborah wanted us to be. We declined the offer formally, in writing, through Patricia's office, making clear that the matter would proceed through proper legal channels. Word of the tabled vote and the swirling rumors spread quickly through Willow Creek's group chats and porch conversations. Neighbors who'd once avoided eye contact now stopped me at the mailbox, quietly sharing their own small grievances against Deborah. adding names and dates to a growing informal record none of us had asked them to keep. But all of us needed. Gary Fenn. Reached briefly by Priya for comment before publication. Denied any wrongdoing. Insisting his company's rates reflected specialized service for a complex private grid system. He declined to address the lack of competitive bidding directly, or his family relationship with the HOA president who'd repeatedly recommended his company for years. The article published that Friday morning under the headline Power and Privilege, inside one HOA president's family business contract, detailing the Fenn family connection,
the pattern of retaliatory delays, and multiple residence accounts, mine included, with Lily's medical documentation referenced respectfully but clearly, giving human weight to the financial numbers.
By that afternoon, the story had circulated through every neighborhood group chat in Willow Creek and several neighboring communities besides, shared and reshared with growing outrage. My phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from people I'd barely spoken to before, several offering to testify if it came to that. Deborah's response, posted briefly to the community forum before being deleted an hour later, called the article sensationalized and factually incomplete, promising a full statement soon addressing these baseless allegations. Screenshots had already circulated widely before she deleted it, preserved by at least a dozen residents including, carefully, myself, the HOA's insurance carrier. Upon learning of the pending lawsuit and the published allegations, reportedly requested an emergency internal review of board conduct. A detail Patricia learned through professional channels and relayed to me with the first genuinely optimistic tone I'd heard from her since we'd started working together. 3 more households came forward that week, encouraged by the article, adding their own documented disputes to Patricia's growing case file, a total of 11. Families now describing a consistent pattern of retaliation, unauthorized fund diversion, and unchecked authority spanning nearly 4 years under Deborah's presidency. I received a call from an unfamiliar number one evening, a former HOA board member, resigned 2 years earlier, who'd read the article and wanted to share her own experience of being quietly pushed out after questioning the very same contractor relationship. Her account added crucial early history to our timeline. Patricia filed the formal lawsuit that following Monday, naming the HOA board, Deborah Krantz individually, and Fenn Power Solutions as defendants, alleging breach of fiduciary duty, retaliatory conduct affecting a documented medical accommodation, and improper diversion of HOA reserve funds. The filing became public record within hours, and Priya covered it immediately. Deborah retained her own attorney quickly, a sharp litigator from the city who requested an immediate closed-door meeting with the full board. Marla excluded pointedly from the invitation. Marla, undeterred, contacted Patricia directly instead, offering full cooperation as a witness rather than aligning herself with Deborah's increasingly isolated defense. The HOA's emergency board session, called in response to mounting pressure, drew the largest resident turnout anyone could remember, spilling out of the clubhouse into the parking lot. People listening through open windows as Deborah attempted, unsuccessfully, to frame the entire situation as a misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion. A motion to formally suspend Deborah's presidential authority pending investigation was introduced by a previously silent board member, seconded immediately, and passed by a narrow but decisive margin. Deborah remained a board member in name only, stripped of her signing authority, her contractor relationships, and her control over community funds. I watched from the third row as the vote was read aloud, feeling something unclench in my chest that had been tight since that first dark Tuesday night 5 months earlier. It wasn't over. Repeatedly, it wouldn't be. Not yet. But something fundamental had shifted. Undeniably. In that room. Deborah left the clubhouse that night without speaking to anyone. Gary Fenn waiting for her in the parking lot. Both of them driving away quickly as residents watched in near silence. Renee squeezed my hand as we walked out together. "You did that," she said quietly. I shook my head. The following weeks brought discovery proceedings, depositions, and an independent forensic accountant hired jointly by the HOA's insurance carrier to fully trace the reserve fund diversions. Patricia kept me updated regularly, cautious as always about overpromising, but increasingly confident that the paper trail Marla had preserved would prove decisive. Lily, now stable on a consistent treatment schedule with our power reliably restored, asked me one evening why I kept disappearing into boring meetings with Miss Patricia. I told her, simply, that some grown-ups make rules that aren't fair, and sometimes fixing that takes a while. She seemed satisfied with that answer. The forensic accountant's preliminary findings, shared with Patricia under discovery, confirmed what Marla's notes had suggested. Nearly $43,000 in reserve funds diverted toward inflated Fenn Power Solutions invoices over 3 years, alongside a clear, documented pattern connecting service delays to residents who'd recently challenged Deborah's authority publicly. Deborah's attorney attempted several procedural motions to delay or narrow the case, arguing the retaliation claims were speculative and unrelated to the financial allegations. Patricia countered with the timeline itself. My public question at that spring meeting, followed within weeks by the generator denial, followed by the 5-month outage. The judge assigned to the case, reviewing the initial motions, declined to dismiss any portion of the complaint, noting in her written order that the documented pattern across multiple households presented sufficient basis to proceed to full discovery on all claims. Patricia called it a strong early signal. Not a guarantee, but strong. Gary Fenn's company, facing its own mounting scrutiny, quietly lost its contract renewal that quarter, replaced by a competitively bid vendor selected through a transparent process for the first time in years. Word spread that Fenn Power Solutions had also begun losing other municipal contracts as the story gained regional attention. I sat for my deposition in early winter. Patricia beside me, Deborah's attorney across the table asking careful, probing questions about the timeline, the medical documentation, my interactions with Deborah at every stage. I answered plainly, without embellishment, letting the folder I'd kept for months speak for itself where words felt insufficient. Deborah's own deposition, according to Patricia afterward, went considerably worse for her side. Under oath, she struggled to explain the lack of competitive bidding, grew visibly flustered discussing her family relationship with Gary Fenn, and at one point contradicted her own earlier written statement about not controlling contractor timelines. Marla's testimony, given calmly and consistently with her preserved notes, described specific instances where Deborah had directed her, verbally, to slow walk service requests. For residents who'd caused problems, language Marla said she'd written down immediately afterward each time, uneasy even then about what she was being asked to participate in. The independent former board member added her own sworn account, describing an earlier, nearly identical pattern involving a family who'd left the neighborhood entirely rather than continue fighting years before I'd ever moved in. The pattern, once hidden, now stretched back further than any of us had originally realized. Priya published a follow-up piece detailing the deposition revelations, drawing renewed regional attention and, notably, an inquiry from the state's HOA Regulatory Oversight Office, prompted by the sheer number of documented households affected across multiple years under a single unchecked authority figure controlling both governance and utility access. Deborah's personal reputation in Willow Creek, already badly damaged, collapsed further as more neighbors came forward publicly, no longer afraid of retaliation now that her authority had been formally suspended. Holiday decorations that year seemed almost defiant. Entire streets lit brightly. A quiet collective statement nobody needed to say out loud. Tom mentioned one evening, half joking, that our once dark house was now the most brightly lit on the block. String lights draped generously along the roofline. Lily insisting on an extra display of her favorite inflatable snowman. Felt, finally, like reclaiming something that had been quietly stolen from us for months. Patricia called in mid-December with an update that shifted everything. The HOA's insurance carrier, facing mounting exposure across 11 documented households and clear evidence of fund diversion, had authorized preliminary settlement discussions rather than risk a public trial with a jury now certain to hear months of damaging sworn testimony. Deborah, cornered and desperate, made her most extreme move yet before settlement talks could even properly begin. She filed a countersuit against me personally, alleging defamation over my public statements at the tabled meeting, seeking damages and, more alarmingly, requesting a restraining order limiting my presence at future HOA meetings entirely. Patricia called the countersuit a classic desperation play, noting that everything I'd said publicly was either documented fact or protected opinion clearly labeled as such. Still, the filing meant new legal fees, new stress, new sleepless nights spent worrying whether this fight would ever, truly, come to an end. Deborah's countersuit hearing revealed something none of us had anticipated. Under questioning about her financial motivations, she admitted, reluctantly, that Fen Power Solutions had quietly covered nearly $12,000 in her personal legal retainer fees during the ongoing dispute, a detail her own attorney seemed visibly unprepared for her to disclose. That single admission, made under oath, transformed the entire financial picture. This wasn't simply favoritism toward family. It was, potentially, an ongoing quid pro quo arrangement. HOA contract favors flowing to Gary Fenn's company in exchange for direct personal financial support flowing back to Deborah during her legal battle against residents she'd wronged. The judge, visibly troubled by the disclosure, ordered an immediate expansion of discovery to include Deborah's personal financial records related to the Fenn family, over strenuous objection from her attorney. Patricia later told me this single ruling likely reshaped the entire trajectory of the case toward far greater exposure for Deborah personally. Meanwhile, Deborah's escalation continued outside the courtroom as well. An anonymous complaint was filed with Child Protective Services against our family, alleging unsafe living conditions related to Lily's medical needs, timed suspiciously close to a scheduled deposition date. The investigator who visited found nothing remotely concerning, closing the case within a week. Patricia flagged the CPS complaint immediately as a potential retaliation tactic, requesting its timing and origin be formally noted in our ongoing filing. Though the complaint's source couldn't be definitively proven, the coincidence, layered atop everything else, painted an increasingly desperate picture of someone willing to weaponize anything within reach. Renee reported a strange incident that same week. Her car's tires slashed overnight. No note, no explanation. Occurring the day after she'd given a particularly damaging deposition regarding Deborah's historical pattern of retaliation against other households. Police investigated but found no direct evidence linking anyone specific to the vandalism. Frank, similarly, received an unexpected code enforcement citation from the county, unrelated to the HOA entirely, questioning permits on a deck he'd built years earlier without incident. He suspected, though couldn't prove, that someone with connections had made a call. Patricia documented it anyway, alongside everything else accumulating steadily. I began locking our doors more carefully, glancing twice at unfamiliar cars parked nearby, an uneasy vigilance settling over what had once felt like a peaceful, ordinary street. Tom installed a doorbell camera that week, more for peace of mind than any specific threat, though the timing felt anything but coincidental to either of us. Deborah, meanwhile, began appearing at community events again despite her suspended authority. Standing near the clubhouse entrance during a children's holiday gathering, watching quietly, several parents, uncomfortable, quietly moved their families toward the far side of the room, an unspoken but unmistakable collective judgment settling over the space. The Regulatory Oversight Office's inquiry, prompted by PRIA's follow-up coverage, formally opened that January, requesting full HOA financial records dating back 5 years, a broader window than even Patricia's civil discovery had reached. Deborah's attorney requested another delay, citing the burden of compiling records spanning that length of time. Marla, still cooperating fully, provided the Oversight Office with her own preserved notes independently, expediting the review considerably. Investigators noted, in an early preliminary finding shared with Patricia, that the pattern of contractor favoritism appeared to extend even further back than the 3 years initially documented in our civil filing. Gary Fenn's company, already reeling from lost contracts, faced a separate business licensing review triggered by the Oversight Office's findings, examining whether Fenn Power Solutions had submitted falsified competitive bid documentation in prior years to create the appearance of proper procurement procedure where none had genuinely existed. Deborah's desperation seemed to deepen with each new development. She attempted, through an intermediary, to reach Marla directly outside legal channels, allegedly offering to cover Marla's mounting legal fees in exchange for softening her testimony. Marla refused and reported the contact immediately to Patricia, who documented it as potential witness tampering. That allegation, once formally raised with the court, drew swift attention from the judge, who issued a stern warning against any further contact with witnesses in the case. A warning that, according to courtroom observers, visibly rattled Deborah for the first time throughout the entire proceeding, her usual composure finally, fully cracking. I received one final, unsettling message during this period, an anonymous letter left in our mailbox, and signed, warning vaguely that some fights aren't worth winning if you lose everything else along the way. Patricia had it analyzed and filed as evidence, another thread in an increasingly troubling pattern of intimidation. Tom wanted to consider dropping the case entirely at that point, worried more about our family's safety than any financial outcome. I understood his fear completely, shared it honestly, but found myself unable to walk away now. Not after everything Marla, Renee, Frank, and 8 other families had already risked to stand with us. Patricia arranged additional security measures around key depositions and hearing dates, coordinating quietly with local law enforcement given the documented pattern of intimidation. The case, she reminded me gently, was no longer just about our 5 dark months. It had become something the whole community, and now regulators, needed resolved properly. The Oversight Office's expanded review uncovered a second, previously unknown vendor relationship. A landscaping company owned by Deborah's college roommate similarly awarded contracts without competitive bidding, similarly overpriced compared to market rates, quietly draining additional HOA funds over several years alongside the more prominent Fen Power Solutions arrangement. This second discovery transformed public perception even further. What had begun as one family's fight over 5 dark months now clearly resembled a broader, sustained pattern of financial self-dealing spanning nearly Deborah's entire presidency, touching almost every corner of the HOA's operational budget in ways residents had never been able to see clearly before. Priya's third article, published that February, carried the headline "The Full Picture: How One HOA President Quietly Redirected Nearly $80,000 in Community Funds," drawing statewide attention and prompting several other HOA communities to publicly announce their own independent financial audits, wary of similar hidden arrangements within their own boards. Deborah's countersuit against me, weakened considerably by the mounting evidence against her own conduct, was voluntarily withdrawn by her attorney that same month. A quiet retreat that Patricia called the first real sign she understands how badly this is going for her, even if she won't say so publicly. The HOA's insurance carrier, facing now substantial documented exposure across the widening scope of misconduct, significantly increased its settlement offer, a figure Patricia described as still insufficient given the full scope of damages, but a meaningful signal that resolution, in some form, was drawing closer than any of us had dared hope months earlier. Lily's health, meanwhile, had stabilized considerably with consistent power access restored, her nebulizer routine steady and uninterrupted through the winter months, without a single flare-up requiring emergency care. A small, quiet victory that mattered more to me, honestly, than any legal outcome still unfolding around us. I found myself, in rare quiet moments, reflecting on how a single porch light violation notice had unraveled into something so much larger than either Tom or I could have ever imagined. That first spring afternoon, Deborah complimented my flower beds with a smile that never quite reached her watching eyes. Renee's slashed tires, still officially unresolved, remained a quiet undercurrent of unease even as the broader case gained momentum. She told me she didn't regret speaking up, not for a moment, but admitted the personal cost had been higher than she'd expected when she'd first agreed to share her story with Priya. Frank's deck citation, meanwhile, was quietly dropped by the county after his attorney raised procedural irregularities in how the complaint had originated. Further evidence, though circumstantial, suggesting a coordinated pattern of harassment against those who'd chosen to speak out publicly against Deborah's long unchecked authority within our community. The Oversight Office scheduled a formal public hearing that spring, inviting community testimony alongside the financial findings, a rare and significant step that Patricia said would likely determine whether Deborah faced not just civil liability, but potential criminal referral for embezzlement given the scale and duration of the diverted funds uncovered. I spent the week before that hearing organizing my thoughts carefully with Patricia's guidance, deciding to focus my testimony not on anger, which I still carried plenty of, but on Lily specifically, the mistreatments, the ER visit, the simple, human cost of 5 months lived in deliberately imposed darkness. The public hearing drew an overflow crowd to the county building, far exceeding even the largest HOA meeting turnout. Residents from Willow Creek and several other affected communities, filling every available seat, standing along the walls, waiting patiently through hours of testimony from investigators, forensic accountants, and finally, residents themselves. I testified last among the resident witnesses, describing the timeline plainly, the porch light notice, the generator denial, the 5 dark months, Lily's ER visit, ending simply with the fact that our neighbor's power had been restored within hours while ours sat deliberately unresolved for 152 days. Deborah, present throughout the hearing but declining to testify herself on her attorney's advice, sat rigidly at the defendant's table, expression unreadable, as investigator after investigator laid out the financial trail connecting her personal legal fees, her family's contracting business, and the community's steadily drained reserve fund across nearly 4 years. The Oversight Office's preliminary findings, read into the public record that day, concluded there was substantial evidence supporting both the civil claims and grounds for referral to the county prosecutor's office regarding potential embezzlement and fraud charges tied to the diverted reserve funds and falsified bidding documentation uncovered during the review. A collective sound moved through the room when those words were read aloud. Not quite a cheer. Something quieter and more exhausted. The sound of people who had waited a very long time to hear their experiences formally, officially, undeniably validated by someone with actual authority to say it out loud. Deborah left the hearing that day flanked by her attorney. Cameras from 2 local news stations capturing her brief. Tight-lipped no comment as she moved quickly toward a waiting car. Gary Fenn, notably, was nowhere visible in the crowd that afternoon, his company already facing its own separate licensing revocation proceedings. Patricia met with me afterward in the county building's quiet hallway, her expression more openly emotional than I'd seen throughout the entire case. "This is bigger than we even hoped for going in," she said. Criminal referral changes everything about her leverage in settlement talks now. She has almost nothing left to bargain with. The insurance carrier, watching the criminal referral unfold in real time, moved quickly to finalize settlement discussions, eager to resolve civil exposure before any criminal proceedings could further complicate or inflate the eventual damages figure. Patricia began serious settlement negotiations that same week, armed with an unusually strong position. I received a call from Marla that evening, her voice lighter than I'd heard it in months. "I just wanted you to know," she said. "Resigning from that board and telling the truth is the first thing I've done in years I'm actually proud of." I thanked her, meaning it more than she probably realized. Deborah's neighbors, once carefully polite out of fear, now largely avoided her entirely, her once immaculate lawn showing small signs of neglect. Holiday decorations, noticeably absent that year from a house that had once always been first and brightest on the street. Quiet, visible reflection of everything unraveling around her. Tom and I sat down together that week and calculated, carefully, everything the 5 dark months and everything since had actually cost us. Motels, spoiled food, the failed generators, medical bills, lost freelance income during the worst of it, legal costs partially offset by Patricia's contingency arrangement. The number was staggering. Patricia, reviewing our documented damages alongside the broader settlement framework being negotiated across all 11 affected households, estimated our family's individual claim alone, given Lily's medical documentation and the extended duration of our specific outage, could reasonably reach into the tens of thousands once punitive elements were properly factored in. She's going to fight the number, Patricia warned me honestly. But between the criminal referral, the witness tampering allegation, and 11 documented households, her negotiating position is about as weak as I've ever seen in a case like this. I think we're close, Sarah. I really do. Settlement negotiations stretched through most of that spring. Careful and methodical, Patricia pushing for damages proportional to both the financial harm and the deliberate, documented nature of the retaliation, while Deborah's attorney, working with dramatically reduced leverage, sought desperately to minimize both the dollar figure and any public admission of wrongdoing. I attended several negotiation sessions myself at Patricia's request, watching as spreadsheets and legal arguments slowly transformed 5 months of darkness into concrete numbers, medical costs, property damage from spoiled refrigerated goods, lost income, punitive damages tied directly to the documented retaliatory intent behind the original outage. The criminal investigation proceeded on a parallel track. The county prosecutor's office formally reviewing the embezzlement referral, requesting additional financial records from both Fen Power Solutions and the landscaping company owned by Deborah's college roommate, building what investigators described as a methodical, carefully layered case. Deborah's personal finances, now under closer scrutiny through the expanded discovery order, revealed a home equity line of credit taken out shortly after our lawsuit was filed. Funds apparently used partly to cover mounting legal fees not already absorbed by Gary Fenn's company. A detail suggesting her resources were thinning rapidly. Marla formally resigned her treasurer position that spring, replaced through a properly conducted board election. The first genuinely competitive HOA election Willow Creek had seen in years, drawing record voter turnout from residents eager to finally reshape leadership after everything the past year had revealed about unchecked authority. The newly elected board, notably including Renee as vice president, immediately commissioned an independent financial audit covering the full scope of Deborah's presidency, formally terminated all remaining ties to Fen Power Solutions, and opened competitive bidding for every ongoing service contract for the first time in over half a decade. I watched Renee's swearing in with quiet pride, remembering the nervous woman who'd first warned me over a tomato garden fence, now standing confidently at a podium, promising transparency and accountability to a room full of neighbors who trusted her precisely because she'd risked everything to tell the truth when it mattered most. Deborah, stripped now of both her presidency and her treasurer ally, watched much of this unfold from the sidelines, her remaining board seat largely symbolic, her influence over community affairs effectively dissolved entirely. She stopped attending meetings altogether by early summer, her absence noted but, notably, not mourned by anyone. Patricia's settlement demand, finalized after months of careful preparation, sought a combined figure across all 11 affected households, with our family's individual portion calculated separately given Lily's documented medical circumstances and the significantly longer duration of our specific outage compared to other residents' shorter disputes. The insurance carrier's counteroffer arrived lower than Patricia had hoped, prompting a tense several weeks of continued negotiation. Patricia firmly holding her position, reminding the opposing counsel repeatedly of the criminal referral's shadow looming over any attempt to lowball a settlement that public records would eventually make fully visible anyway. During this tense stretch, I found myself returning often to that manila folder, now 3 inches thick, sitting on our kitchen counter, a physical reminder of everything documented, everything endured, everything that had somehow, improbably, transformed one family's dark 5 months into a reckoning reaching far beyond our own front door. Lily, now 9, asked me one afternoon what exactly had happened with the mean lady from the meetings. I explained it simply, in terms she could understand. Someone with power had used it unfairly, and we'd worked hard, with help from good people, to make things fair again. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her drawing. The prosecutor's office, after months of review, formally announced criminal charges against Deborah that early summer: embezzlement, fraud, and falsification of business records, tied directly to the diverted reserve funds and the fabricated competitive bidding documentation uncovered during the oversight investigation. Gary Fenn faced separate related charges alongside her. News of the criminal charges spread through Willow Creek within hours, confirmed publicly by the prosecutor's office and covered extensively by Priya, whose original tip line message from an exhausted, desperate mother nearly a year earlier had ultimately helped uncover a scheme far larger than either of us had initially imagined. Deborah's attorney, facing both mounting civil settlement pressure and now formal criminal charges, requested an emergency settlement conference, signaling a clear shift in strategy toward resolving the civil claims quickly, likely hoping a resolved civil matter might favorably influence sentencing considerations should the criminal charges proceed toward conviction. Patricia entered that emergency conference with renewed confidence, presenting our family's complete damages calculation alongside the broader settlement framework for all 11 households, making clear that further delay would only continue accumulating additional punitive exposure given the now public criminal proceedings unfolding alongside our civil case. The negotiation that day stretched nearly 6 hours. Patricia stepping out periodically to consult with me by phone, walking through each proposed figure carefully, explaining what it represented, what we'd be giving up by accepting versus continuing toward trial, always leaving the final decision genuinely in my hands. By early evening, a preliminary settlement framework emerged, still subject to final review, allocating damages across all 11 households based on documented harm, with our family's portion reflecting both the extended 5-month duration and Lily's clearly documented medical circumstances throughout that entire ordeal. Patricia called me that night with the proposed number for our family specifically, and I sat quietly on our back porch for a long moment after hanging up, staring at the same dark garage where a small generator had once sat, denied approval, that had somehow, improbably, started everything that followed. Tom and I discussed the offer carefully over the following 2 days, weighing the certainty of settlement against the emotional and financial cost of pushing toward a full trial that could, Patricia reminded us honestly, take another year or more to reach a jury verdict. However strong our position had become, we ultimately decided, together, that settlement made sense for our family, prioritizing closure and stability for Lily over the uncertain additional gains a trial might eventually provide. Patricia respected the decision fully, noting that 10 of the 11 affected households had reached similar conclusions around the same time. The final settlement, formally approved by the court that summer, totaled a combined figure across all 11 households, with our family's individual allocation, once medical costs, lost income, property damage, and punitive elements were fully calculated, reaching just over $70,000, payable jointly by the HOA's insurance carrier and Deborah personally. Patricia explained that Deborah's personal contribution to the settlement, a meaningful portion given her limited remaining assets after the home equity withdrawal and mounting legal fees, would likely require selling her house. The same house where she'd once stood in gardening gloves telling me she would never retaliate against anyone. I read the final settlement documents twice before signing. Tom's hand steady on my shoulder. Lily's laughter drifting in from the next room where she was drawing. Oblivious to the exact number on the page, but not oblivious. Not anymore. To the simple fact that our house stayed lit every single night now. News of the settlement, combined with the pending criminal proceedings, drew renewed statewide attention that summer, prompting several state legislators to publicly announce proposed reforms strengthening HOA financial disclosure requirements and prohibiting undisclosed vendor relationships between board members and family-owned contracting companies going forward. Priya's final article on the saga, published alongside the settlement news, closed with a quote from Renee that stuck with me long afterward.
It took one family refusing to quietly accept an unfair fight to show the rest.
Deborah's house, listed for sale that autumn, sold quickly to a young family who knew nothing of its history beyond what neighbors quietly mentioned in passing. She moved out of state entirely by winter, according to Renee, who heard it secondhand through the community grapevine that, ironically, Deborah herself had once controlled so completely. Gary Fenn's company formally dissolved that fall amid the mounting legal pressure. Its remaining municipal contracts terminated entirely. His own criminal proceedings still working. Slowly through the court system separately from Deborah's. Though early reporting suggested a plea arrangement was likely given the strength of the documented financial trail against him. I found myself, in quieter moments that summer, thinking often of Frank's warning from that very first cookout, months before any of this had truly begun. "You don't beat her," he'd said. "You just survive her." I thought about telling him he'd been wrong, but honestly, I think we'd simply proven something different was possible. The new HOA board, under Renee's steady leadership, implemented sweeping transparency reforms that year public quarterly financial reports, mandatory competitive bidding for all, contracts over a modest threshold, and a formal, clearly written medical accommodation policy that no future resident would ever need to fight 5 months of darkness to secure. Lily's 10th birthday that fall felt, in some quiet way, like a genuine turning point for our family. The party held in our bright, fully powered backyard. String lights strung generously overhead. No generator humming anywhere in sight. Just an ordinary, unremarkable evening that had taken an extraordinary amount of work to reclaim. The criminal trial against Deborah began that following spring. Delayed slightly by pretrial motions from her defense team, drawing renewed regional attention as the prosecutor laid out, methodically, the years-long pattern of diverted funds, falsified bidding records, and the personal financial benefits flowing back to her throughout her presidency. I attended portions of the trial as a witness, called to testify again, this time under the weight of criminal proceedings rather than civil ones, the stakes feeling different, heavier, knowing that whatever the jury decided would follow Deborah far beyond any settlement check already deposited months earlier. On the stand, Deborah's own attorney attempted to frame the entire situation as a misunderstanding rooted in genuine, if imperfect, community management decisions, arguing she'd believed, in good faith, that Fen Power Solutions offered fair value despite the family connection, and that service delays reflected genuine equipment issues rather than deliberate retaliation. The prosecutor systematically dismantled that framing, walking the jury through Marla's contemporaneous notes, the timeline connecting my public question at that spring meeting to the generator denial weeks later, and finally to the 5-month outage that began precisely when our shared street's routine maintenance window opened and simply never properly closed. Marcus, the young technician who'd once whispered family to me in our driveway, testified reluctantly but honestly about receiving explicit instructions from Gary Fenn to leave our address flagged as do not proceed without authorization. Instructions he'd found strange even at the time but had followed as an employee without questioning further. The forensic accountant's testimony proved particularly damaging, walking the jury through nearly $80,000 in combined diverted funds across both the Fen Power Solutions and landscaping contracts, presented alongside bank records showing corresponding payments flowing back toward Deborah's personal legal fees during the exact period our civil case unfolded. Deborah took the stand in her own defense on the trial's 4th day, composed at first, insisting she'd always acted in the community's best interest, her familiar practiced warmth, noticeably strained under the prosecutor's steady, patient cross-examination about specific dates, specific instructions, and specific financial transfers she struggled increasingly to explain. When confronted directly with Marla's notes documenting a private conversation where Deborah had allegedly said, "Sarah needs to learn that questioning me has consequences," Deborah's composure finally broke entirely on the stand, her voice rising defensively, insisting the note was taken out of context, unable to offer any alternative context of her own. The courtroom, packed with Willow Creek residents who'd taken personal time off work to attend, sat in near total silence during that exchange. The same silence I remembered from the clubhouse meeting nearly 2 years earlier, the moment truth finally outweighed carefully maintained appearances that had protected her for so long. I sat beside Tom in the gallery, Lily safely at school that day, watching a woman who'd once denied a medical accommodation request over a small backup generator now struggling, under oath, to explain why nearly $80,000 in community funds had flowed so conveniently toward her own family and her own legal defense. Closing arguments stretched across 2 full days, the prosecutor emphasizing the deliberate, sustained nature of the misconduct, the defense attorney pivoting toward asking the jury for leniency given Deborah's years of otherwise dedicated community service, a framing that felt, to everyone who'd lived through the past 2 years, deeply and painfully hollow. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning its verdict, guilty on charges of embezzlement, fraud, and falsification of business records, a unanimous decision that drew audible relief throughout the gallery. Renee gripping my hand tightly the moment the verdict was read aloud by the jury foreperson. Deborah's expression, according to reporters seated closer to the defendant's table, showed little visible reaction beyond a slight, involuntary slump of her shoulders, the practiced composure that had carried her through years of unchecked authority finally, completely unable to hold against the simple, undeniable weight of 12 jurors' unanimous decision. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later, allowing time for victim impact statements, and Patricia asked whether I wanted to submit one on our family's behalf. I said yes immediately, without hesitation, understanding this would likely be the last opportunity to speak directly about everything those 5 dark months had truly cost us. Gary Fenn's separate trial, scheduled shortly afterward, ultimately resolved through a plea agreement, his own attorney apparently recognizing the overwhelming documentation already established during Deborah's proceedings made a full trial defense largely untenable given the shared financial records connecting both cases so thoroughly and so clearly. I spent the weeks before sentencing drafting and redrafting my victim impact statement, ultimately settling on something simple and specific rather than sweeping. Describing Lily's ER visit precisely, the exact hour her oxygen levels dropped, the exact fear of sitting in a hospital hallway wondering whether cruelty had a limit. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the trial itself. Willow Creek residents filling the gallery alongside residents from the other affected communities, who'd followed the case closely through Priya's ongoing coverage. Everyone waiting to hear what consequence would finally match the scale of harm now fully documented. I delivered my statement standing at a small podium facing the judge, my voice steadier than I expected, describing not just the financial cost but the quieter one, the nights Lily asked why our house stayed dark, the trust in fairness and community that had taken so long and so much effort to rebuild. Renee, Frank, and 3 other affected residents also delivered statements that day, each describing their own version of the same pattern. Small disputes met with disproportionate, calculated retaliation, painting for the judge a complete picture of authority wielded not for community benefit but for personal comfort and quiet, sustained financial gain. The judge, before announcing sentencing, addressed Deborah directly, noting that the case represented a profound betrayal of the trust residents place in community leadership, specifically citing the retaliatory power outage affecting a documented medical need as particularly troubling among the broader pattern of financial misconduct established at trial. Deborah was sentenced that day to 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation, alongside a court-ordered restitution requirement covering the full scope of diverted community funds, separate entirely from the civil settlement our family and 10 other households had already received months earlier. The restitution order meant Deborah would spend years, likely most of her remaining working life, repaying the community she'd once presided over so completely, quiet, ongoing consequence that would follow her long after any prison sentence concluded, a debt owed not just financially but to the trust she'd deliberately broken. Gary Fenn's plea agreement resulted in a shorter sentence alongside his own restitution obligations, his once thriving family business now permanently dissolved, his professional licensing revoked entirely, ensuring he could never again hold a municipal or HOA maintenance contract anywhere within the state going forward. I left the courthouse that afternoon feeling something I hadn't quite expected. Not triumphant exactly, but settled, finally, in a way that 11 months of darkness followed by 2 years of fighting, had never fully allowed me to feel until that precise, quiet moment walking down the courthouse steps into ordinary afternoon sunlight. Priya's final piece on the case, published that week, closed the loop entirely on a story that had begun with a single desperate tip-line message from an exhausted mother nearly 2 years earlier, now standing as one of the most thoroughly documented HOA accountability cases the region had ever seen. Renee called that evening, her voice warm and a little disbelieving. "Remember when I told you at that tomato garden you don't beat her, you just survive her?" she said. "I was wrong, Sarah. We didn't just survive." I laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in years. Marla sent a short note that week as well, simple and heartfelt, thanking me for giving her the courage to finally speak up after years of quiet complicity she'd carried uncomfortably for far too long. I wrote back thanking her equally, knowing none of this would have unfolded the same way without her willingness to testify. Frank stopped by unannounced one Saturday afternoon, bringing a small housewarming gift for our newly renovated back porch, funded partly by our settlement. A quiet gesture that felt like closure between two neighbors who'd once bonded, uneasily, over shared fear of the same person now serving time for exactly what he'd warned me about. The new HOA board's transparency reforms, now fully implemented under Renee's leadership, drew positive attention from several neighboring communities, some sending representatives to study Willow Creek's revised bylaws as a model for preventing similar concentration of unchecked authority within their own developments going forward. I found myself, that autumn, invited to speak briefly at a regional homeowners association conference, sharing our family's experience alongside Patricia, offering practical advice to other residents facing similar patterns of retaliation, documentation strategies, and the slow, difficult, ultimately worthwhile process of holding unchecked local authority genuinely accountable. Lily, now 11, occasionally asked follow-up questions as she grew older and better understood what had actually happened during those early, confusing years of her childhood. I answered honestly each time, careful not to burden her with more than she needed, but unwilling to hide a story that had ultimately taught our whole family something important. Tom and I used a portion of the settlement, after covering accumulated debts and Patricia's fees, to establish a modest college fund for Lily, a deliberate choice to transform something painful into something durably good. A small act of reclaiming purpose from months that had once felt entirely, hopelessly wasted. The remaining settlement funds went toward paying off our home's mortgage balance early, a decision that felt, oddly, like the most fitting use possible, securing permanently, completely, the very house Deborah had once tried to make unlivable through 5 months of deliberately withheld power. I still kept the original manila folder, now retired to a closet shelf rather than our kitchen counter, 3 inches thick with printed emails, violation notices, and dated photographs of our dark house against a fully lit street. I couldn't quite bring myself to throw it away, a strange, hard-earned artifact of everything survived. Renee's vice presidency turned into a full HOA presidency the following year, elected unanimously, running unopposed after 2 years of demonstrated transparency and fairness that had rebuilt genuine community trust in a leadership position that had once felt, under Deborah, more like a personal fiefdom than a shared responsibility. The medical accommodation policy Renee's board had implemented was formally tested once. A year later, when a new resident requested approval for a home dialysis machine's backup power system. The request was approved within 72 hours. No fines, no appeals, no 5 months of darkness. Exactly the outcome our family had once fought so hard, unsuccessfully, to secure for ourselves. I ran into that new resident at the mailbox afterward, and she mentioned, unprompted, hearing about some big HOA scandal a few years back that apparently explained why the current board moved so quickly and carefully on medical requests. I simply smiled and told her I was glad the policy worked the way it should. Deborah's name occasionally surfaced in local news coverage over the following years. Updates on her probation status. A brief mention when the state legislature's HOA disclosure reform bill, informally nicknamed after our neighborhood in local press coverage, passed into law, closing exactly the kind of contractor loophole that had allowed her scheme to persist so long undetected. Gary Fenn. According to Renee's occasional updates from lingering community grapevine connections, relocated out of state as well, attempting unsuccessfully to restart a similar, contracting business elsewhere, apparently struggling under the weight of a permanently revoked professional license and a criminal record that followed him regardless of geography. I thought, sometimes, about the strange, winding path from a single porch light violation notice to a state legislative reform bill bearing our neighborhood's informal nickname, understanding finally that the small, absurd rule enforcement that had first caught my attention had never really been small at all, just the visible edge of something much larger. Lily's asthma, well managed for years now through consistent, uninterrupted treatment, had become simply one ordinary fact among many in her otherwise ordinary childhood. Soccer practices and school projects and sleepovers with friends. The terrifying uncertainty of that one difficult year finally, thoroughly, receded into manageable memory rather than present fear. Tom and I marked the second anniversary of the settlement quietly at home. No fanfare. Just an ordinary dinner in our fully lit kitchen. Lily doing homework at the table nearby. The hum of her old nebulizer occasionally audible from her room upstairs. An unremarkable, precious sound neither of us took for granted anymore. Patricia, closing out her file on our case permanently that year, sent a brief final note along with copies of the completed paperwork. Cases like this don't come along often, she wrote. Thank you for having the patience and the courage to see it all the way through. You changed more than your own situation. Sarah, the full accounting. Once every settlement figure, restitution order, and legal cost was finally tallied across the entire case, revealed the true scope of what Deborah's retaliation had ultimately cost her personally. The sale of her house, her legal defense fees, her portion of the civil settlement, and her court-ordered restitution combined. Patricia calculated the final personal financial toll specific to Deborah individually, separate from the insurance carrier's contribution, at just over $70,000 once. Every direct cost was properly totaled. House sale proceeds redirected towards settlement obligations, legal fees, and the beginning installments of her lengthy restitution schedule. Struck me, reviewing those final numbers with Patricia one last time, that the figure landed almost precisely at $70,000 personally borne by Deborah. An ironic, fitting symmetry to a conflict that had begun over her refusal to approve a $200 backup generator for my daughter's medical equipment 2 years earlier. I thought back often to that exact moment in her kitchen doorway. Gardening gloves on, insisting rules were rules. No exceptions. Exceptions being how neighborhoods fell apart. The irony wasn't lost on me that her own unwillingness to bend for a documented medical need had ultimately cost her everything she'd once controlled so tightly. The $70,000 figure became, informally among residents who'd lived through those 2 difficult years, a kind of shorthand for the entire saga, mentioned occasionally at community gatherings, always with a knowing look exchanged between those who remembered exactly how it had all begun with one small, absurd violation notice. Renee mentioned once, at a community barbecue years later, that the story had become something of local legend, retold at neighborhood welcome gatherings as a cautionary tale about unchecked authority and, more hopefully, as proof that documentation, patience, and a genuine willingness to fight quietly but persistently could eventually rebalance even the most entrenched imbalance. I never sought out news of Deborah directly after the sentencing concluded, but occasional updates reached me anyway through the small, connected world of former Willow Creek residents who still kept loosely in touch. She'd reportedly taken a modest bookkeeping job in another state, her restitution payments arriving steadily, if slowly, each month. There was a strange, unexpected symmetry in that detail. I thought, a woman who'd once controlled an entire community's shared power grid now working quietly, anonymously, sending steady monthly payments back toward the very people she'd once dismissed so completely, rebuilding, dollar by careful dollar, some fraction of what she'd taken. Gary Fenn's attempted business restart, similarly, apparently struggled under the weight of his revoked licensing and criminal record, according to the last update Renee passed along, forcing him eventually into unrelated work entirely disconnected from the electrical contracting field where he'd once built a quietly lucrative, quietly corrupt family enterprise. Marla, meanwhile, remained an active, respected member of Willow Creek's community long after her resignation from the treasurer position, occasionally volunteering to help train new board members on proper financial transparency practices, transforming what had once been years of uncomfortable complicity into a genuinely constructive, ongoing contribution. Frank passed away peacefully 2 winters later, and at his memorial gathering, several longtime residents specifically mentioned his willingness to stand up first. At that pivotal clubhouse meeting, crediting his simple, honest testimony that day as the moment the room's collective silence had finally, decisively broken. I stood at that memorial thinking about how differently everything might have unfolded if Frank hadn't stood up first. If Renee hadn't spoken quietly over a garden fence. If Marla hadn't finally found the courage to break ranks. Understanding fully, perhaps for the first time, how much any single act of accountability truly depends on others. The state's new HOA disclosure law, still informally carrying our neighborhood's nickname in local press references years later, had by then been credited with uncovering 2 additional, similar schemes in unrelated communities. Board members forced into transparency by requirements that simply hadn't existed before our case forced the legislative conversation into being. I received an unexpected letter that year from a woman in another state entirely, describing a strikingly similar situation unfolding in her own HOA community. Having read about our case through Priya's now widely syndicated original coverage, she asked for advice. I spent an entire evening writing back everything I'd learned. That correspondence became the beginning of an informal, Occasional practice, other affected homeowners reaching out over the following years, and me offering whatever guidance I could about documentation, patience, and the slow, difficult, ultimately achievable process of holding unaccountable local authority genuinely responsible for its actions. Lily, now a teenager, occasionally accompanied me to these informal conversations, listening quietly, absorbing lessons about fairness and persistence that I hoped would serve her well long after she'd fully forgotten the specific, frightening details of the 5 dark months that had originally taught her mother these hard lessons. Tom and I sometimes discussed, in quiet moments, whether we'd do anything differently if faced with the same situation again from the very beginning. We always arrived at the same answer: document everything sooner, trust our instincts earlier, and never underestimate how much a single quiet, persistent voice could ultimately accomplish. The house we'd nearly lost to darkness and debt became, over the following years, simply our home again, unremarkable in the best possible way. String lights appearing every winter without complicated calculation. Generators relegated permanently to the garage's back corner. Used occasionally now only for genuine, ordinary storm outages. I found myself, on quiet evenings, genuinely grateful for the strange, difficult path those 2 years had carved, understanding that our family's fight had ultimately protected not just ourselves, but 11 households directly, and countless others indirectly, through reforms and legal precedent that would likely outlast all of us involved. Renee's continued leadership brought Willow Creek a genuine, sustained sense of community trust over the following years. Annual transparency reports met with modest applause rather than suspicion. Board meetings running efficiently and fairly. The kind of ordinary, unremarkable governance that had once felt, under Deborah, entirely impossible to imagine. Deborah's restitution payments, according to the final court records Patricia shared with me upon the case's official closure, continued steadily for years afterward. Quiet, ongoing acknowledgement of consequence that would follow her financially long after every headline and courtroom appearance had faded from public memory entirely. I thought often about Deborah's own words from that very first porch light conversation years earlier: rules are rules, no exceptions, exceptions being how neighborhoods fall apart. In the end, it hadn't been an exception that broke Willow Creek. It had been her own unchecked, unaccountable exercise of power, finally, properly checked. The manila folder, still sitting quietly on that closet shelf, occasionally caught my eye during unrelated searches for other documents. A physical reminder that documentation, patience, and quiet persistence had ultimately proven more powerful than any amount of institutional authority wielded carelessly, arrogantly, without genuine accountability behind it. Lily's college fund, steadily growing over the years, eventually funded her first semester at State University. Quiet, meaningful bookend to a story that had begun with fighting for her basic medical needs and ended, years later, with securing her future in a way that felt deliberately, poetically full circle. I drove her to campus that August, thinking, briefly, about how far we traveled from that first dark Tuesday night years earlier. Lily's nebulizer running on borrowed car batteries in our driveway, neither of us imagining then how thoroughly that frightening chapter would eventually resolve into something genuinely, durably good. Patricia and I stayed loosely in touch over the years, occasionally exchanging updates, her firm handling several similar cases afterward, some citing our precedent directly in their own filings, a professional legacy she seemed genuinely proud of whenever we spoke, always crediting my persistence as much as her own legal strategy. Priya's original tip line story, still occasionally cited in journalism programs as an example of sustained, methodical investigative reporting, remained a source of quiet pride for both of us whenever our paths crossed at the occasional community event or regional journalism panel discussion years afterward. Looking back across everything, I understood finally that the true cost Deborah paid wasn't only the $70,000, though that number remained, satisfyingly, precisely tied to the harm she'd caused. It was also her house, her reputation, her freedom for a time, and the entire community's trust she'd never fully earn back. Our family settled, in the years that followed, into an ordinary rhythm none of us had taken for granted since those 5 dark months, power humming reliably. Through every season, Lily's health steady, Tom's classroom stories filling our dinner conversations, the manila folder finally, truly, a closed chapter. Willow Creek itself transformed gradually into a genuinely different kind of community. Transparent board meetings drawing steady. Engaged attendance rather than fearful silence. New residents welcomed with clear, fair policies that no family would ever again need to fight 5 months of darkness to secure for themselves. The state's broader HOA reform, still occasionally referenced in legislative discussions years later, continued protecting homeowners across the region from the exact combination of unchecked authority and undisclosed vendor relationships that had once nearly cost our family everything we'd worked so hard to build together. I occasionally reflected on Marla's quiet courage, Renee's steady leadership, Frank's simple honesty, and Patricia's methodical persistence, understanding that no single person had won this fight alone. It had taken an entire community, each person contributing their own small piece of courage, to finally hold real accountability in place. Deborah's story, meanwhile, faded slowly from active local conversation, remaining mostly as a cautionary reference, a name occasionally mentioned when new residents asked why Willow Creek's bylaws included such thorough, specific conflict of interest disclosure requirements. The living legacy of exactly the reckoning her own choices had ultimately demanded. And through it all, our house stood exactly where it always had, lights glowing steadily through every ordinary evening. No longer a battlefield, no longer a symbol of anything except the quiet, hard-won, entirely unremarkable comfort of simply being safe, secure, and finally, fully in control of our own home again. People sometimes ask me now, years later, whether it was worth the fight, the exhaustion, the fear, the 2 long years spent building a case one document at a time. I always tell them the same thing. I didn't choose that fight for justice or vindication alone. I chose it for Lily, and for every family after us who'd never have to. Deborah Krantz taught me, without ever intending to, that quiet documentation and patient persistence could outlast even the most entrenched unchecked authority. That neighbors who feel powerless individually can become formidable collectively, and that sometimes the very rules someone weaponizes against you become the exact tools that finally hold them accountable. Our porch light still isn't board approved. Technically, Some small clerical detail never quite refiled after everything settled. Nobody's mentioned it in years. I like to think that's its own small, quiet justice, one forgotten rule left gently, deliberately unenforced, glowing warm and steady over our door every single night since.